In 1985, Carl Sagan wrote his only novel, and it became the movie Contact in 1997. The story revolves around a signal broadcast to planet Earth from a distant and advanced civilization. And the clue in the signal, that it is a non-random signal, that it's come from an intelligent source, is a repetition of prime numbers in the frequency of the signal. That is something that couldn't occur naturally. This is from an intelligent source. Where did Carl Sagan get that wonderful idea of the repetition of primes being a signature? It's a strange coincidence, because Vladimir Sherbak and Maxim Akulov, who are two top authorities in the field of human DNA research, have identified exactly that signature in the DNA coding for human beings. This is information we've only had in the last decade. So how did Carl Sagan know this in 1985? In our storytelling, we're actually remembering something from our prehistoric past. We had the opportunity in 2003 to test one of the oldest stories, if not the oldest story, of human civilization, and it's the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Author and researcher Paul Wallace probes the world's ancient mythologies for clues about the origins of the human race, and has published several books in the field of mysticism and spirituality. In the last decade, his work has probed the world's ancient mythologies for the insights they hold on our origins as a species and our potential as human beings. Paul's work in church ministry has included training pastors in the interpretation of biblical texts, working as a troubleshooter for communities of faith, and serving as an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. His background as a senior churchman makes it all the more surprising that Paul's latest book argues that human origins lie in our prehistoric contact with extra-terrestrial species.
We had the opportunity in 2003 to test one of the oldest stories, if not the oldest story, of human civilization, and it's the Epic of Gilgamesh. A story that just might prove humanity's ET roots. Now, Gilgamesh is a really interesting figure. The Sumerian and Babylonian narratives speak about rulership over human beings, or kingship, as having come down from the skies. It's those who've come down from the skies who govern over human society for a long, long time, aeons and aeons. And then there comes a point where they hand over to human kings, and they somewhat recede into the background. In that story, there's a crossover king, a hybrid person called Gilgamesh. He's part sky people, part human. Now that's a motif that recurs in mythologies all around the world. Go to any country in the world and probe the local mythologies, and there'll be a story of human-god hybrids. But is it just a story? Or is it the memory of something from our prehistoric past? Well, in 2003, we had the opportunity to test that scientifically, because it appeared that we had unearthed Gilgamesh's tomb. In April 2003, a German-led research team announced it had found King Gilgamesh's tomb. It was an incredible moment in the history of religion and archaeology. Not much more than a month after the first US invasion of Iraq under George H.W. Bush, a research team led by Jörg Fassbinder of the Bavarian Department of Historical Monuments in Munich announced the incredible discovery they had made. With scarcely contained excitement, Fassbinder spoke to the BBC and said, "The most surprising thing was that we found structures already described by the Epic of Gilgamesh. We covered more than 100 hectares. We have found garden structures and field structures just as described in the Epic. By differences in magnetization in the soil, you can look into the ground. The difference between mud bricks and sediments in the Euphrates River gives a very detailed structure. I don't want to say definitively that it was the grave of King Gilgamesh, but it looks very similar to that described in the Epic. We found, just outside the city, in the middle of the former Euphrates River, the remains of such a building as could be interpreted as a burial place. What an outstanding opportunity to test the relationship of those mythologies against scientific fact. We could DNA test the remains of that person in the tomb marked Gilgamesh. Potentially, it was one of the most significant archaeological finds in history. Once the find had been located and cordoned off, the First Iraq War ended within a matter of days. What this gave us was the opportunity to understand the Sumerian kings list. Is it a literal account of beings from another planet ruling over planet Earth and then handing over to humans? Or is it something else? Should we read it differently? Here we had the opportunity to test it, and it was a unique opportunity. Sadly, the public investigation of the site was quickly interrupted. In 2005, Fassbinder wrote mournfully in the scientific journal of Dossier, Archéologie et Sciences des Origines. To translate it from the French text, contrary to what some journalists have claimed, it isn't at all proven that our find corresponds with Gilgamesh's under-river tomb. We are sorry not to be able to give a more precise idea of the results of our magnetic investigation. But since 2003, all the archaeological sites of Iraq have been under a serious and growing threat. The lack of security in the country and the trafficking of art and artifacts are causing the total and irreversible destruction of archaeological sites by looters. All archaeological structures will be better preserved if we leave them under the ground, untouched and buried. And 16 years later, it's still buried. How can you bury an opportunity like that? Why would you not want to know if that account of human origins is rooted in fact or is pure fiction? It was important enough that during the Iraq War, protection was given so that Fassbinder could get in there with his team, but not important enough to probe in the 16 years since. This is a test that could answer one way or another. Was humanity engineered by an ET species, the sky people of the Sumerian narrative, or was our evolution pure chance? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we read the story of the human being growing up wild and living like an animal in harmony with the other animals, and then being civilized by a female entity who introduces him to city living. That's how it goes in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but that story resurfaces in Tarzan. Again, the female entity, Jane, finds the wild man living in harmony with the animals and then civilizes him and brings him to the city. It's there in Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, in which Mowgli reaches the point where he's attracted to the human girl and wants to go to the human settlement to live as a human being. The Zulu tell the story of Mbabwana-Warisa, the female entity who teaches them how to farm and how to make beer and how to live as a human society. Why is that story so resonant? Why does it keep resurfacing? Now, in those cases, I don't believe it's to do with probing the stories of antiquity and recycling them. I believe those are examples of how in storytelling our minds enter a place where we download information from a wider field of consciousness. And in our storytelling, we start telling the truth without realizing that's what we're doing. The narratives of Contact, Planet of the Apes, and the Epic of Gilgamesh all point to an ET intervention in the evolution of Homo sapiens. In those mythologies and stories, are we remembering something from our prehistoric past? Are we simply retelling the same story over and over, but it remains pure fiction? In the Tomb of Gilgamesh, we have the opportunity to answer that question definitively. This is a test that could answer one way or another. Was humanity engineered by an ET species, the sky people of the Sumerian narrative, or was our evolution pure chance?